In the fading warmth of a Charleston evening, the streets of the old neighborhood carried whispers of stories untold, shadows stretching as if reaching out for secrets. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias, their sweet perfume a poignant contrast to the heavy silence settling in. It was here, on a narrow road flanked by ancient oaks, that Evelyn moved briskly, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. Evelyn had seen 55 summers, each etching its mark in the soft lines of her face. Her auburn hair, now threaded with silver, was pulled back tightly, a habit she'd formed in her youth to keep distractions at bay. Today, though, it served a different purpose, to hide the tremble that had taken root in her hands. The light fabric of her dress, once vibrant and now faded from too many washings, clung to her as if to remind her of the weight she bore. For years, Evelyn had been the quiet presence in her home, adapting and enduring, shaping herself into the unyielding rock Martin demanded. But stones, even those weathered by time, can break. Martin, her husband of 3 decades, was a figure who commanded respect with the smoothness of a well-practiced smile. To the town, he was the gregarious storyteller at the local diner, the neighbor with a wave for passers-by. To Evelyn, he was the storm that rattled the shutters and splintered the wood. The unspoken truth of their marriage was an open secret, spoken only in the way people turned their eyes when her voice shook or when her laugh seemed too careful. Tonight, however, the storm had left their house and spilled into the street. Martin's footsteps, heavy with fury, echoed behind her, cutting through the symphony of crickets that filled the air. "You think you can just walk away, Evelyn?" The words were spat, laced with disbelief and something darker. He closed the distance between them, his silhouette growing larger as the street lamps flickered on, one by one. A sudden rustling from a nearby alley broke the tension for a heartbeat. There, beneath a crooked street sign, a pair of eyes reflected the orange glow of the lamps. Shadow, a stray dog whose name was earned from his habit of appearing and vanishing without warning, watched with a wariness born of survival. He was lean, almost skeletal, with fur matted from years without care. Yet, in his gaze, there was a fierce, undiminished fire. Shadow had known hunger and the bite of cold. He dodged kicks, avoided traps, and listened for the rustle of garbage that promised a meal. But tonight, the commotion stirred something different in him, a memory of warmth long forgotten, the instinct to protect that had once belonged to a past he could no longer touch. Evelyn felt the grip of fear lock her knees as Martin's fingers caught her arm, pulling her back with a force that stole her breath. Pain flared where his grip tightened, and her protest was no more than a gasp. Around them, windows darkened, shutters closed just a fraction more tightly. This was how silence protected itself. But silence wasn't the only one observing. From the shadows, a low growl rumbled, slicing through the charged stillness. It was a sound that made Martin pause, just enough for Evelyn's eyes to shift, wide and astonished, to the figure that leaped from the darkness. Shadow, his thin body a blur of motion, surged forward with an intensity that defied his ragged appearance. His bark erupted, sharp, fierce, and filled with a purpose that even he hadn't known lay within him. Martin's eyes widened as the dog lunged, teeth bared in a snarl that was pure, unfiltered warning. The shock of the sudden assault forced him to stagger back, releasing Evelyn's arm. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough bark of an oak. Heart racing, she turned to see the dog, now planted firmly between her and the man who had loomed so large for so long. Shadow's fur stood on end, muscles taut and trembling with adrenaline. His eyes, dark as midnight, met Martin's with a stare that dared him to take a step closer. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the night holding its breath as predator and protector faced each other. Evelyn's chest heaved, the pulse of disbelief and hope mingling in her veins. She knew the stories of stray dogs roaming the neighborhood, scavenging through bins, and dodging the authorities. But never had she imagined one would become her shield, her unlooked-for savior. Shadow, sensing her gaze, glanced back just once, his expression softening for the briefest moment before he resumed his vigil. The sound of distant voices, Neighbors too late emerging from their homes stirred Martin into action. He spat a curse, stepping back into the dark as if the night itself had reclaimed him. Shadow did not move until Martin's shadow was gone, swallowed by the labyrinth of alleys. Evelyn remained motionless, her breath coming in shallow bursts as the realization set in. Shadow stood before her, his sides heaving with the exertion of the confrontation, but his posture was resolute. He had positioned himself like a sentinel, a guardian carved from determination, though his frame told a story of hunger and hardship. As the adrenaline ebbed, Evelyn reached out with tentative fingers, brushing the matted fur that covered his trembling body. Shadow flinched but didn't retreat, his eyes flicking up to meet hers, and in that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them. The noise of doors creaking open and hushed murmurs began to filter in. The neighbors, emboldened by the absence of immediate danger, started to appear, eyes wide with curiosity and lingering fear. Evelyn drew a shaky breath, feeling the weight of their silent observations pressing down on her. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she did not shrink under the gaze of others. "Are you all right, Evelyn?" The question came from Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with a shawl perpetually wrapped around her thin shoulders. Her voice, usually trembling, was laced with worry as she stepped onto her porch. "Yes," Evelyn replied, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. She glanced at Shadow, who had sat back on his haunches but kept his eyes fixed on the street, ears twitching at every sound. "I'm all right." Mrs. Thompson's eyes shifted to Shadow, recognition sparking in them. "That's the stray, isn't it? The one that's been around the old mill?" "Yes," Evelyn whispered, the syllable thick with emotion. The dog's dark eyes moved to her, softer now, almost questioning, as if asking if he'd done the right thing. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, and she let them fall. This creature, who owed her nothing, had stood against the storm when no one else would. Shadow's gaze held hers a moment longer before he moved, muscles coiling as if preparing to slink back into the night. But Evelyn's hand, steady now, reached out and touched his head more firmly this time. "Stay," she said, voice stronger, more sure. The word was not just for him. It was a plea to the courage that had surged within her, a command to herself to stand as unyielding as the animal before her. The neighbors lingered, some inching closer, others whispering among themselves. Shadow, sensing the shift in attention, leaned into Evelyn's touch, the tension in his lean frame easing as he recognized that, for now, the danger had passed. He was no longer just a shadow flitting between alleyways, but a presence that demanded acknowledgement. As the last light of day succumbed to the night, Evelyn looked around at the gathered faces. There was surprise, even admiration, mingled with the habitual caution bred from years of ignoring what should never be ignored. Martin's specter would not disappear overnight, and she knew his return was inevitable. But with Shadow at her side, the gnawing fear that had anchored her heart for so long loosened, replaced by a tentative seed of resilience. Shadow did not return to his alleys that night. He stayed by Evelyn's side, his presence a silent declaration that he was no longer alone in his battles, and neither was she. The days following the confrontation brought an unexpected quiet to Evelyn's life. For the first time in years, the air inside her modest home felt lighter, as if the shadows that had lurked in every corner had been pushed back. Shadow had become a constant presence, moving with a cautious loyalty that spoke volumes of his past. He would curl up at the foot of her porch during the day, ears pricking at every unfamiliar sound, and would follow her with silent steps when she ventured into town. The town's reaction to the incident was mixed. Some whispered their speculations, casting furtive glances at Evelyn and her newfound companion as she passed by. Others, especially those who had seen Shadow leap to her defense, treated him with newfound respect. A few children, emboldened by stories they had overheard, would sometimes sneak bits of bread or scraps to him when they thought no one was watching. Shadow accepted these offerings with a wary tilt of his head, always glancing back at Evelyn as if to seek her approval. Evelyn herself felt the changes like an undercurrent. The bruises on her arm, once a badge of her silence, were now a testament to a moment that had shifted something deep within her. When she walked down the aisles of the small grocer or passed through the church doors on Sunday, she held her chin a little higher. The whispering townsfolk and their darting eyes no longer made her shrink. Instead, she met their gazes head-on, Shadow's silent strength coursing through her. But change was never without consequence. Martin's absence stretched into days, then a week. The relief of not hearing his heavy footsteps outside the door was tempered by the uncertainty of where he had gone or what he was planning. Evelyn knew his pride, knew that he wouldn't let the public humiliation pass without retribution. Each night, as the sky darkened, she felt the familiar edge of fear creep back, whispering that he would return when the world was asleep and defenses were down. Shadow, as if sensing her unease, became more vigilant. He patrolled the yard with an intensity that belied his wiry frame, pausing only to nuzzle Evelyn's hand as if to reassure her. The bond between them grew in those tense evenings, unspoken but undeniable. Evelyn found herself talking to him, voicing thoughts she had kept buried for years. "Do you think he'll come back, boy?" she asked one night, her voice quivering in the cool air. Shadow's response was a steady gaze, dark eyes reflecting the lamplight, an unspoken promise that whatever came, he would face it with her. Then, as the second week waned, a shadow darker than the night returned to the edge of Evelyn's life. It was late, the town swallowed by sleep, when the sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the silence. Headlights cut through the gloom, casting long, sharp beams across her living room walls. Evelyn's heart raced as she stood, the reality she had feared stepping out of the night. Martin's silhouette filled the doorway moments later, broad shoulders blocking out the pale moonlight. His eyes, bloodshot and narrow, swept the room, settling on Evelyn with a coldness that made her skin crawl. "Did you think you could get away with this?" he growled, voice low and threatening. He took a step forward, and Evelyn instinctively shrank back, the room seeming to close in around her. Before she could find her voice, a snarl, raw and deep, shattered the tension. Shadow appeared from the hallway, moving in front of Evelyn, muscles coiled and eyes blazing with a fury that left no room for doubt. Martin's expression flickered with disbelief, then rage, as he took another step. Shadow's bark erupted, a sound so fierce that it seemed to shake the walls. The noise was enough to stir the closest neighbors, lights flicking on in the nearby houses. Martin's bravado wavered under the combined weight of Shadow's growl and the realization that eyes were beginning to turn in their direction. He hesitated, the flash of anger in his eyes shifting to something sharper, more calculating. Shadow stood unmoving, a living barrier between Evelyn and the man who had haunted her dreams for years. The stray that had once known only the loneliness of alleys and empty streets now stood in defiance, embodying a loyalty forged not by ownership but by choice. Evelyn felt a rush of strength flood her limbs, a resolve that echoed the fierce protective stance of the dog before her. Martin spat on the floor, the final act of his diminished power, before backing out into the night. He left the door ajar, and the silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of an engine retreating into the distance. Shadow turned to Evelyn, eyes searching hers as if asking if she was all right. The fear that had clung to her chest released its grip, replaced by gratitude so deep it ached. She knelt, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck, the warmth of his fur grounding her as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Evelyn's living room, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. The quiet after the storm was palpable, as if the house itself sighed in relief. Shadow lay at her feet, his eyes fluttering open to the warmth, but his ears remained alert, flicking at the slightest creak of the old floorboards. He was still on guard, still ready, yet there was a subtle ease in the way he pressed his body close to Evelyn's chair. Evelyn glanced down at her protector, a wave of gratitude welling up inside her. The night had brought a shift not only in her fear but in her understanding of what it meant to be safe, to be seen, and to be valued. Shadow had proven himself not just a companion but a fierce guardian, one who had chosen her as much as she had now chosen him. The small town, always quick to notice changes, soon learned of what had transpired that night. Mrs. Thompson, who had watched the commotion from her window, spoke of it to her friends at the grocer, and soon, whispers grew into a story that swept through the streets like a summer wind. Some came by to check on Evelyn, their visits hesitant but sincere, bringing baked goods or small comforts as gestures of solidarity. Others merely passed by more slowly than usual, casting glances that spoke of newfound respect mingled with curiosity. Martin did not return. Whether he had left out of fear or shame, or whether he was simply biding his time, Evelyn did not know. But the absence was a reprieve she did not take for granted. For the first time, her home felt like a sanctuary rather than a cage, and Shadow had become the keeper of its peace. Days turned into weeks, and a sense of normalcy, fragile and tentative, began to take root. Evelyn spent her mornings tending the small patch of garden by the porch, hands in the earth as the sun warmed her back. Shadow would lie in the grass, eyes half closed, but never more than a heartbeat away from her side. The bond between them grew deeper with every shared moment, every unspoken reassurance that neither was alone anymore. One afternoon, a knock at the door startled them both. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at Shadow, who stood immediately, posture alert but not tense. She opened the door to find Sheriff Daniels, a tall, steady man with kind eyes and a hat perpetually tipped back on his head. "Morning, Evelyn," he said, voice low and careful, as though afraid to disturb the newfound peace. "Morning, Sheriff," she replied, the hint of a smile touching her lips. Shadow, standing close, watched the exchange with unwavering attention. "I just wanted to check in, make sure everything's all right. Haven't seen Martin around," he said, shifting his gaze briefly to Shadow. "And I heard you've got a new friend here." Evelyn reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "Yes, Sheriff, we're both all right. And yes, this is Shadow. He's been looking out for me." The sheriff's eyes softened, the lines around them crinkling as he nodded. "Good to hear. Sometimes it's those who have the least who give the most, isn't it?" He touched the brim of his hat. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." As he turned to leave, Evelyn watched him go, feeling the warmth of his words settle into her heart. Shadow leaned against her leg, a gentle pressure that said everything without a sound. The dog, who had once lived in the margins, forgotten and overlooked, had become the hero of his own story, and hers. That evening, as the sky turned hues of orange and violet, Evelyn sat on the porch with a cup of tea in hand. Shadow lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, eyes scanning the street out of habit, but with a contented calm that mirrored her own. The air hummed with the songs of crickets, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves above them. "You saved me," she whispered, the words barely louder than the wind. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound, and he lifted his head to meet her gaze, dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Evelyn reached out, smoothing the fur between his ears, her fingers tracing the path of the life that had brought him to her door, to this moment. The peace they had found wasn't just a reprieve, it was a beginning. As the last light of day disappeared, leaving only the soft glow of the stars, Evelyn felt the tightness in her chest release fully for the first time in years. Shadow, the dog who had once belonged to no one, was now more than just a companion. He was her guardian, her symbol of resilience, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could find a way through. As the days turned into months, Evelyn and Shadow became a familiar sight in the neighborhood. People would nod or wave as they passed, some offering words of kindness that Evelyn had once thought impossible to hear without flinching. The bond between woman and dog had not only reshaped her life, but had begun to shift the way the community viewed those quiet, unseen struggles that so often went unnoticed behind closed doors. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat on the porch mending an old quilt, a small boy with tousled blonde hair approached, his eyes wide with curiosity. He held out a piece of bread, clearly torn from the sandwich he had been eating. "Can I give this to him?" he asked, glancing nervously at Shadow. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling at the innocence in the boy's question. "Of course, sweetie. Shadow's friendly, aren't you, boy?" Shadow, as if understanding, moved closer, his tail wagging gently as he accepted the treat with surprising gentleness. The boy laughed, delighted. Before darting back to where his mother stood watching, a small wave exchanged between the women. Shadow's once ragged coat had begun to shine, the dullness replaced by a healthy sheen that spoke to the care and love he now received. His eyes, once wary and guarded, glimmered with trust whenever they met Evelyn's. The once empty nights were now filled with soft conversations and shared silences that carried more meaning than any words ever could. Despite the peace that had settled over their lives, the memory of that dark night when Martin had last returned still loomed like a storm cloud at the edge of her mind. Evelyn knew better than to believe he was truly gone. Men like him did not disappear without a fight. But each day that passed without the echo of his boots on the gravel was a day Evelyn allowed herself to feel stronger, braver. One evening, the quiet was shattered by the rumble of an engine, and Evelyn felt her chest tighten instinctively. Shadow's ears perked up, his body tensing as he recognized the familiar sound. A truck rolled slowly up the street, the glint of its chrome bumper catching the light of the setting sun. It parked just beyond the gate, and Martin stepped out, his eyes darting to Evelyn with a mix of anger and disbelief. Evelyn stood slowly, feeling Shadow press against her leg, a reassuring presence that kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. Martin took a step forward, his expression darkening. "So this is how it is now," he spat, the venom in his voice as sharp as ever. He looked thinner, more ragged than before, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a desperate energy. "Go away, Martin," Evelyn said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. She felt the weight of Shadow's gaze, his body poised and ready. "You don't belong here anymore." Martin's lips curled into a sneer. "You think some mutt is going to protect you?" He stepped closer, his fist clenching at his side. But before he could take another step, Shadow lunged forward, his bark tearing through the air like thunder. The sound was enough to make Martin flinch, the bravado slipping from his face as he took an involuntary step back. The neighbors, who had been drawn to their windows and porches by the sound of the truck, watched in silence. Shadow stood between Evelyn and Martin, fur bristling and teeth bared, a guardian unyielding and fierce. Martin's eyes shifted nervously, catching the stares of those who had once turned away. The strength of the crowd, silent but palpable, pressed on him like a physical weight. With a growl still rumbling in his chest, Shadow inched forward, daring Martin to challenge him. But Martin's shoulders sagged as the realization set in, he no longer held power here. With a muttered curse, he retreated to his truck, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of soft applause, hesitant at first, then growing as the neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye, and the young boy who had offered Shadow the bread called out, "Good boy," with a giggle. Evelyn looked down at Shadow, who had relaxed but remained at her side, his dark eyes searching hers for reassurance. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, the tension melting from his frame as he let out a contented sigh. Evelyn turned to face the onlookers, her chin held high and her heart finally free of the weight it had carried for so long. That night, Evelyn sat on her porch with Shadow curled beside her, the stars above winking into view one by one. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the promise of peace that had eluded her for years. Shadow's steady breathing was the only sound, a comforting reminder that she was not alone, and that even the darkest nights could give way to the dawn. It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.